Hi, everybody. Welcome. If you follow me on social media, you probably know that I'm a little bit of an FDR nut. I quote him a lot on Twitter and so forth. I've been reading biographies about him. I've always been fascinated not only by him, but by his wife, Eleanor. So I'm very excited today to have an opportunity to speak to a great scholar, a real expert on Franklin Roosevelt and on his presidency. Harvey Kaye is Professor Emeritus of Democracy and Justice at the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. He is a labor unionist, an historical and political commentator, and a frequent guest on progressive shows in every medium. He has authored and edited 18 books, including Thomas Paine and The Promise of America. I hope to have him come back another time and talk about Thomas Paine. And The Promise of America, The Fight for the Four Freedoms: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Those were the four freedoms that FDR talked about. Take hold of our history. That's the subtitle for The Fight for Four Freedoms. And FDR on Democracy, this book right here. Let's get right to it. What an honor. Meet Professor Harvey Kaye. Harvey Kaye, thank you. Thank you so much for being with me. I'm really excited about this conversation.
I bet I'm more excited than you are.
Oh, that's so kind of you. Well, I have, first of all, I want to tell you about my father a little bit. When I was growing up, no matter what election there ever was, and he died in 1995, if you ever asked my father, "Who'd you vote for, Daddy?" he'd say, "Roosevelt." So I was raised with a great love of Roosevelt. It was part of the stories of my growing up, the things that he had done for the country, and for my father specifically, his having grown up in poverty and so forth. But as I have grown older and as I have gone through the challenges of my own generation, history has mattered more and more to me for the ways that it informs. And I've had a long fascination with the founders, and it's almost like every year, every era of my life, there's a figure in history that I become almost obsessed with. And recently, in the last few years, it's been FDR. I've been reading a lot, particularly more about Eleanor than I ever have before. So I'm fascinated to hear from you, who are truly a scholar, a historian, an expert on the man and the president, and what the years of Roosevelt's presidency and the New Deal meant to us. So why don't we start there? Why now? Why is it that to you and to me and so many of us, Roosevelt has such resonance right now? What did he do that was so important for his time? And what does the philosophy, the political philosophy and behavior that he represented, what is its relevance for our time?
Okay, it takes a lot to answer. It's not, but I'll try my best not to be forever speaking. But I do want to I want to respond to something you said as you led to the question. You said, why now? What is it that resonates? And this is something that when I worked on my Thomas Paine book, and it then came pretty obviously to me when I was working on my Franklin Roosevelt Four Freedoms book, and it also then continued as I worked on these speeches in the book you held up. Here's the thing. We know that Americans are not good at remembering history. Okay? In other words, you go out on the street and you ask them to remember this or that, and they won't exactly remember. But that doesn't mean they don't carry with them a kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, sort of a deep cultural memory, and it's linked to what it means to be an American, I think. And what I discovered in the course, again, of my Thomas Paine work, which literally retells the entire American story in terms of that legacy, and then this more recent work on Roosevelt and the Greatest Generation, since, obviously, the 30s, what I found is that during moments of real crisis in America, I mean, let's call them mortal crises, because I don't think there's any doubt that we have a story of America that has seen mortal crises. That at those moments, and this is important, at those moments, somehow Americans found it in themselves to actually do what some people might like to call the progressive thing, and I generally will call the radical thing. They literally, despite themselves, despite all their faults and failings, and the faults and failings of their leaders, they will carry out and pursue radical democratic action. Goes back to the revolution, goes back to the Civil War. And thus, it's like it becomes almost an instinctive thing to Americans that when they face crises, they know they should look back. Okay, look back. So, for example, in the 1990s, where this whole, in many ways, this crisis has been going on for 45 years. But in the 1990s, there emerged, first of all, what was called Founding Fathers fever, or founder chic. And too often, the pundits, the historians, and others generally made light of it or treated it as a mass culture phenomenon of a fairly, fun kind of thing. But when you think about it, despite what we may think of the 90s, there were seriously deep crises in the wake of Ronald Reagan and George Bush I's tenure as president. And what Americans were doing is they were asking themselves, well, what does it mean to be an American? What do we need to do? And as a consequence, thus emerged as founding father chic. Similarly, and the two seem to sort of be, running in tandem, there began this fascination for FDR and all the more the greatest generation. Now, no less than what happened with the founders stuff, a lot of it became commercialized, and a lot of what developed in the books and the films, etc., left out truly fundamental things about the 30s, the 40s, and in fact, the lifetime of your father and my father. Okay? So, for example, and I promise you I will get to the punchline in this. What they left out, whether the conservatives just sought to either lambaste or suppress the story of the 30s and 40s and basically reduce it to the undeniable heroism of a generation in the face of fascism. That should never be denied and never undervalued. But what they left out is that in order to enable themselves to confront fascism, they first transformed the United States in the 1930s. Not as much as our generation might have liked, but they definitely radically transformed America. They changed the relationship between government and working people. They empowered working people. They empowered themselves, along with their president, enabling that through legislation. So basically, a whole series of developments occurred, and we can talk about those later. And our parents' generation, again, for all of their faults and failings, they actually carried with them a certain understanding of what it meant to be an American. And so when we confront look, we are in the face of a moral crisis. We all go about our daily lives. At times, we even can utterly forget the crisis we're confronting. But this coming November's election is probably the most consequential midterm election that I have ever seen coming up. And it's going to transform the country in a decidedly, I hesitate to use the word evil too readily, but in a decidedly evil fashion. Or it may well enable us to survive to try to do the right thing in the wake of it. So I think what it is that when people are asking themselves, well, what are we going to do? I mean, we obviously are not living through a new FDR administration right now. It's not like they're reminded of that. But I will remind everyone, especially those who might not have been old enough to know, back in 2008 when Barack Obama was running for president, and I could show you, I found the pile of these magazines the other day, every major magazine, especially the politically oriented ones, whether they were whether it was The Nation on the left or the National Review on the right, they had the image of Roosevelt or they transformed Obama into Roosevelt. Now, that was a reflection of the fact that those magazines knew that there was a deep yearning for that kind of, not just experience, but for that kind of action. A president and a generation mobilized to redeem the American promise. And so, in some ways, even if the schooling that people receive about Roosevelt and the New Deal is not what it should be, decidedly not what it should be, it's sure as hell a reminder that the way things are is not the way they have to be, and there was a generation, and there were generations that somehow grabbed hold of that deep memory and literally, I don't want to, rose up, you might say, to confront the challenge. Sorry, I think those are the kinds of things that are happening right now. But of course, for too many years, the right has done everything it could to suppress the memory and, in fact, to attack the memory of FDR and the New Deal. And liberals have run from it at the same time. There has been, take me back to the Bernie Sanders campaign as we talk, okay? And I'll show you what I mean. Even the most progressive of candidates, by the way, did not do that. And for what it's worth, and I want people to hear me say this, I read your book, Love and Politics. I read it. And what really struck me, I mean, it actually, to be honest, it utterly surprised me, okay, that you had a firmer sense of this story and narrative that I'm referring to than any other Democratic candidate of those years that came out in 2019, I believe. I mean, I was really amazed, and I'm willing to go on record saying that, as I'm doing now.
Thank you. Thank you. I do appreciate your saying that. There's a whole conversation there, but we don't really need to go into that.
I'm going to tell you something, and I mean this sincerely. Mm-hmm. In the notes I sent to you today, I said to you, we should have one in which I interview you.
I would love
about that narrative that I found in that. But maybe we'll get to it here.
Yeah, that would be an honor. I'll send you the earlier book that I'd written called Healing the Soul of America, where I had gone further into the historical.
No kidding.
I want to say three things in response to the marvelous things that you just said. First of all, you were talking about the radicalism, that Americans are capable of taking radical action. And of course, one of the lines that you have quoted and that others have quoted is Roosevelt having said, "It has become clear to me that we must become fairly radical for at least a generation." Yeah. I think that word, of course, the root, radical means of the core, at the core, get to the core of things. But people sometimes are afraid of that word. But you're right, when things have come to a point of crisis, including such as the one we're in now, the word radical should be seen in a far broader context than some stereotypical narrative regarding violence or something like that.
And on that note, I won't go into it much, but I do want to say, when you and I were, sorry, I'm revealing that we're of similar ages. When we were growing up, there was a really good word that referred to the radicalism of the right. And I've tried my best to get people to use it again, but it's very hard. The word was reactionary. And people just don't use that these days. And it's a shame because it enables people, such as in 2015, Claire McCaskill, to say Trump and Bernie were two extremists, they were the two radicals, that kind of thing. It literally...
the phrase, how dare she...
Yeah.
Yeah, the phrase, how dare she, comes up for me, but let's move on.
Okay.
Then the second thing that I wanted to point out about what you were saying was you said Americans aren't good at remembering. And I'd like to suggest that has more to do with us than it has to do with past generations, who I think were better at remembering. The Gettysburg Address, 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. When he was talking about that and what that meant, and that it was a nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that was why they were on that great battlefield. That meant something to people. That wasn't highfalutin language. Yeah. He was really talking to where people were at and their understanding that this was the justification for the Civil War. We live at a time, and I'm sure you're aware of this yourself, obviously, as a former professor and so forth. We have 11 states in this country that don't even require, in grade school, half a year of learning about American history, American civics, American governance. So when you say Americans aren't good at remembering, how can you expect people to be horrified at the assaults on the Bill of Rights when they weren't even taught in school what the Bill of Rights even means, and when all they hear about is the Second Amendment, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with the failure of the American educational system, but even that, I think, has to do with the forces that you're talking about, which would prefer that people forget, that would prefer that people lose the through line. And if we lose that through line, and you probably read it in my book because I think I talked about it in that one, if these first principles and these great constitutional factors that make our entire history hold together and make sense to some extent, if they're only written on parchment or on stone walls, but they're not imbibed by every generation, then we lose the plot. And that's, it seems to me, what's to be so dangerous now. The other thing I want to talk about is Barack Obama, because I do think it's my experience, Harvey, talking to audiences as much as I have over the last few years. I do, and I think you and I would definitely agree with this, about this. Americans have an instinctive understanding that America matters. And
Absolutely.
when we elected Barack Obama, he had tapped into and harnessed for his own political purposes a profound yearning on the part of Americans who knew we needed to self-correct. That, to be honest, is why I resent him so much. Because what he failed to understand, as I see it, but correct me if I'm wrong, one of the things when I've been reading about Franklin and Eleanor, they understood that democracy better do its job or people would go to fascism or communism.
Yeah.
And they said that we don't have to worry about fascism or communism as long as democracy does its job providing for the people. And that if democracy does not provide for the people, then the people will look elsewhere. And so to me, the Obama years were a great, a tragic failure to give people the sense of hope based not just on sloganeering, but based on policies that made a difference in their lives.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and I wrote pieces about the fact, and I'll bring it right into my own classroom back when I was teaching in 2008. I only gave it up a couple of years ago because of the pandemic. My students, and this was across the board, my students were absolutely thrilled at the prospect of Barack Obama becoming president. They worked for his election. They were ready. They were ready to make real those three words, yes, we can. It really tapped into it. And then it was as if, as soon as he entered the White House, it just utterly disappeared. Okay,
That's right.
Utterly disappeared. And I'll tell you, and I'll give you an example of what I mean. Undeniably, pursuing an improvement in American healthcare law was to be welcomed, but not that law, period. Okay, not that law. But even worse is that there was a bill that was ready to go. He had 60 votes in the Senate at that time, and if he couldn't make sure all 60 went with him, he could have figured out how to twist their arms. Or, I mean, as a young guy, he should have been able to figure it out. The Employee Free Choice Act, okay, that would have empowered workers to secure collective bargaining rights by way of unions much more readily than the current status of labor law. I mean, it would have transformed the workplace in that sense. And he just left it to the wayside, probably imagining, well, I want to get this healthcare thing through. And on top of that, he made the healthcare plan itself hang on negotiations with 2 U.S. senators from Maine, as I recall, probably thinking, well, I guess the big problem the Clintons had with healthcare is that they created a private healthcare commission back in the 90s, and they were negotiating with nobody. But neither the Clintons in the 90s nor Obama and his team after 2009, when he took office, ever considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they ought to mobilize Americans behind the idea of some kind of new national healthcare plan, okay? So that, and I'm going to tell you, I'll just jump ahead, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead, but Joe Biden, when he entered the White House, undeniably, Americans needed the American Rescue Plan. It was, for a brief while, it looked like this might be a New Deal moment, right? But actually, if you think about it, what would have been really smart and very FDR, along with Robert Wagner and the senators who propelled FDR inside of Washington, would have been good if he put right up on top of his agenda voting rights and the PRO Act, right?
Yeah.
In other words, get Americans engaged. Don't just raise people's hopes, literally raise speak to their anxieties, engage their energies. That's what FDR knew how to do, and that's what the Democrats really haven't done since Well, maybe since FDR, as a matter of fact.
Well, as you said, during the 2008 election, the fervor was there. You were talking about your own students. He did harness all of that energy, all that inspired activism in order to get elected. But it was, as a friend of mine who was at his inauguration once said, she told me, I felt almost like being at the inauguration, being in the crowd. It was almost as though he was saying, thank you, you're dismissed. Because, as has been spoken about by so many people, he didn't continue to harness that energy in service to effectuating the very things that people were so excited about during the campaign.
You know, to speak of that, because that was a remarkable moment, the inauguration itself. And what I did is I was watching, oddly enough, I was in D.C., but I was watching on TV. And I asked myself, what does it look like from his vantage point? There were 2 million Americans. Think of this image, 2 million Americans in all of their diversity. Right. Out there on the National Mall, just spread about everywhere, you know, clambering on the national monuments. Even as he's speaking, he could see Americans probably off in the distance at the Lincoln, at the World War II Memorial. In other words, they were there, and in many ways, they were physically embracing American history, not only because this was the first African-American president, but also because they're physically embracing the story of America represented by those monuments. And I thought, I kept thinking to myself, surely that's gotta matter to him. And it may well have at that moment, but the problem with Democrats, I'll be blunt about it, is I don't think they trust their fellow citizens. There you go.
Yeah, and the punchline here that matters most is that all of that failure paved the way to Donald Trump. That's why this all matters so much. I want to go back, though, to FDR.
Please, I'm sorry, take us away.
There's nothing to apologize for. It's all fantastic, and you and I could talk for many hours, and I hope in time that we will. But I agree with you about this historical context being so important, because you had Teddy Roosevelt, Roosevelt's uncle, FDR's uncle, who brought in a new period of progressivism radically in reaction to the Gilded Age. Give people who might not know the history, give us a little thumbnail sketch of where America was, why the Depression, what Hoover represented, and what FDR meant to people. He said, I'm going to go into that horror where, a quarter of Americans were unemployed?
That's at the least.
Yeah.
At the least. Because if you think about African-American unemployment, probably was 50%.
Right. And I also want to say, before we even go any further, to those of you who are watching, Harvey, you're Jewish, aren't you?
Yes.
I'm Jewish. We get that Roosevelt had his weaknesses and his shadows.
Oh, please, yeah, absolutely.
We get that he denied entrance to thousands of Jewish children who might have been able to escape Hitler. We get that he created the Japanese internment camps. We get that he perpetrated, or certainly acquiesced to systems of segregation, not only in the military. He would not proactively try to support the lynching law, anti-lynching law. So we're going to be talking a lot about how wonderful FDR was. But I just want to say that caveat before we even begin. Nobody here is saying he didn't have his flaws, both politically as well as personally. Having said that,
let me add one note to that. One note. And I may have said this to you in a text over the past couple of weeks. What is fascinating, and this is what makes American history so truly remarkable, is that those who might have had the least to gain from so much of all of these endeavors refused to be left out. And they fought to be included. They were not going to be denied that they too were Americans. And I'll just lastly close. My closest friend for we were buddies, and he was some years older than I am. He passed away a few years ago. He was born in one of those Japanese American internment camps in Arkansas, while his father was serving in the U.S. Army, the Japanese American family. And despite all of that, he would always say to me, there's just no question about what Roosevelt accomplished. Maybe he felt he could say that because he also knew that Jews had been left out. But the point is that it's important to realize that they would not be denied that they too were American.
Okay, so I still want to go back for those who are not, they know, but they don't really know. So the United States was in a Great Depression. at least a quarter of the people unemployed. There had been the Great Crash, 1929. He's elected in 1932.
Oh, yeah.
And he said to the people of the United States, what did he say? Give me a thumbnail. What did he say we're going to do about the Depression? And what did he do?
Okay, well, and this is unfortunate that so many historians fall into the habit of saying he really didn't know what he was going to do, which is wrong. He had been governor of New York 1928, reelected 1930. While he was governor of New York, he was already beginning what we might call a grand experiment to respond to the challenges of the New Deal.
Kind of a microcosm.
Absolutely. So, for example, he had public works. He was going to harness the St. Lawrence and the rivers up there, and he was going to create hydroelectric energy. He was going to put young New Yorkers to work planting trees in New York State. So, and by the way, the environment was fundamental always to FDR's vision. So what I'm getting at is he was already trying these things out. He was reminding workers in New York that he would do everything he could to defend and even advance their rights in the workplace. So when he ran for president, he actually, in the course of the spring of 1932, he laid out a pretty full-scale agenda. He didn't use the word Social Security. He used the word old age pensions. He talked about public works projects. He talked about enhancing education. He talked about, I could go on. And what's interesting is he recruited.
But I want you to go on and on because too many people, hold on.
Oh,
I think there's some young people who are listening right now, particularly. Do go on. Because this is important that people know this was the beginning of Social Security. He called it old age pensions, which, by the way, everyone came from the Socialist Party. You tell me the public works. Even when people talk about the Green New Deal, when he talked about the American Conservation Corps, which created jobs for people working on the environment, which of course was the precursor to the idea of the Green New Deal. So I do want you to say, what were these things he did that were so foundational and that are still so much a part of the popular imagination as we try to effectuate them in our own time?
Yeah, and let's be clear about the fact that when he recruited his cabinet, it was an indicator as to what the priorities might well be. And I'll use the two prime examples. He recruited Frances Perkins, who he knew for many years in New York State. She was his industrial commissioner when he was governor. And she was asked to become, in an unprecedented fashion, Secretary of Labor. And you can imagine what the old labor boys would think about a woman Secretary of Labor. Nevertheless, he recruited her. And she said to him, I'll do it, but we have to have a deal. I need your promise. High on the agenda will be Social Security. And he agreed. That's first. Similarly, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
She was the only person I read who was in his cabinet the entire time he was president.
Actually, Harold Ickes was too.
Oh, that makes sense.
And that's who I'm going to mention next.
Okay. The New Dealers, they were called. All right, go
Harold
on.
Ickes. Harold Ickes, fascinating figure, was a Republican. Once upon a time, as you probably know, there were progressive Republicans.
Even when we were growing up, Nelson Rockefeller, Lowell Weicker.
Jacob Javits, right?
Yeah,
there were those folks. Right. So he recruited Harold Ickes from Chicago, okay? Not just because he was a progressive Republican. He was, for a while in the 1920s, the president of the NAACP chapter in Chicago.
Wow.
And he had a reputation of being the friend to Native American reservations.
Wow.
He brought him in. So these are the kinds of things. He had little doubt he was going to create a progressive administration. In fact, in 1926, I guess it was, he gave a speech up at Milton Academy in Boston. And he told the high schoolers there, these are prep schoolers, but high schoolers, he talked about the resistance to change. And he said, we shouldn't be surprised that conservatives have a hold on government longer than we liberals. They probably use that term. What I fear, however, is that if conservatives hold on to government too long, that will jeopardize, that will threaten the American promise. And he feared that possibility. And later, while he's president, he gave a similar speech where he actually used the word fascism might well result if conservatives hold on too long. Well, anyhow, so he was committed, determined to have a progressive, across the board, a progressive administration. Okay. Now, when he took office, in the first 100 days, think about this, in the first 100 days, he got through a banking act. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps that you mentioned. They created the Public Works Administration, which would take time to get going because that was where they would issue contracts to do big projects, big public works projects. But what's also significant is he created the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He signed the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Industrial Recovery Act into law. Now, both of those would be found unconstitutional by a still conservative court in 1935. And I'll talk about that later if we have time. But here's the thing that people don't know about. They think, well, it's to help boost agriculture. It's to help get industry going again. And there was no doubt that was the intention. But in both of those acts, encouraged by the progressive senators with whom he was close, who, by the way, included progressive Republicans and progressive Democrats, they built in the National Industrial Recovery Act, for example, collective bargaining rights for workers on the federal level. And when he signed it, and also the first federal minimum wage, and when he signed it into law, he said, you got to love this. I mean, why don't we hear people talk like this today who enter the White House? No company should be allowed.
Because people who talk like this aren't allowed to get to the White House. Let's be very clear about that.
Absolutely. How could I be so naive? I apologize.
Yeah, really, thank you. I know you know better. All right, go on.
You bet I should know better. He said, no company, I'm only slightly paraphrasing, I'm going to use his exact words as much as I can. No company should be allowed to exist in this country that does not pay a living wage. And what if Biden had said that instead of sitting back and watching the $15 an hour minimum wage die because 8 Democratic senators blocked it, including the 2 from his home state of Denmark, listen to me, his home state of Delaware, one of whom was his own mentee, Chris Coons. I mean,
well,
sorry,
yeah.
go.
Yeah, we're living at a time where the majority of Americans would need a 70% pay raise to be making a living wage. That's where we have come to today. Let's go back a little bit to what you were talking about, his relationship to conservatives and to the whole concept of conservatism. Now, Eisenhower would later say that the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. The high-minded conservative wants to, quote unquote, conserve those things which are eternally true. The progressive and the liberal says, yes, but we have to apply these things to immediate circumstances. Roosevelt himself came out of a social order. He was New Yorker. He was a Roosevelt, for God's sake. He was tall, he was dark, he was handsome, he had everything going for him. He was from those moneyed classes. He called them the economic royalists, right?
Yes.
And he understood that they didn't want to just conserve those things which were eternally true. They wanted to conserve those things which were good only for them. Yeah. And you know, one of the things that was so fascinating to me in all the historical knowledge about Roosevelt is the emotional and psychological effects that his getting polio had on him. He was a young man who had it all. And he's confronted by an unimaginable horror. You know, Eleanor would say that it taught him infinite patience and perseverance. They worked for years hoping they would find a cure. It slowly dawned on him at the deepest level there would be no cure. He would never use his legs again. But when he went down to Warm Springs, Georgia, I'm so fascinated by what happened to him in terms of his heart cracking open in a way that was so necessary for him to be the man we needed him to be, bringing forth the New Deal. The people that he met in Warm Springs, Georgia, didn't know from Roosevelt. I mean, they knew that Teddy Roosevelt maybe had been president. They didn't know from the Gilded Age society that the Roosevelts were born into. They didn't know about the fancy stuff. They just knew he was another sufferer like them. And they treated him that way. And I always felt when he went down to Georgia, it seems so clear to me, Harvey, that he came into contact with people he would not necessarily ever have come into contact with unless they were his servants. And here there were the people that he needed, who he was depending on, who helped him. And I have always thought that that was, just like Bobby Kennedy, it was the assassination of John that turned him into the Bobby Kennedy that we knew. And it was Roosevelt's polio that just cracked him open, because otherwise it makes no sense why a Roosevelt would bring forth that kind of radical action on behalf of the working people of the United States.
Yeah, 1912, when he was first running, I think it was 12, I don't think it was 2000, I don't think it was 1910, it was 1912, when he first ran for major public office, New York State Senate, and won, he gave some speeches that year that indicated that he was seriously struggling with what it would mean to be a progressive. He was struggling with it. He actually talked about the fact that, well, if he stresses this too much, he talked out loud about this. He gave a talk at the People's Forum. If I do too much of this, they'll call me a socialist. If I do too much of that, they'll think I'm just another capitalist, basically, that kind of thing. And he coined a term which is awkward as could be, liberty of the community, okay? But what he was really trying to get at was the imperative that there are public and human interests that should not be allowed to be trampled upon by corporate power and industrial titans. Okay, that's clear what he's yearning to accomplish. And I can tell you that Frances Perkins, who knew him, she was convinced that what changed him was the polio. And I think it's the case that it was already in his mind. You know that during World War II, he was during World War I, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he was in charge of the war effort on the naval side. And during those years, he actually gave a speech in which he spoke of the 1% and the 99%.
He did?
Yeah. And so this is a guy who it was already in his mind. And after he lost, he was on the ticket in 1920 for the Democrats, after they lost because of the League of Nations question. That was pretty much what cost him the election. He decided he was going to write a history of the United States because he said, all the history books are failing to get at the fact that Americans were going to go places right from the beginning. That's how he put it. And he was very much inspired by his two presidential heroes, his cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, who was a renowned writer of history and biography, and Woodrow Wilson, who was also had been a professor at Princeton University and later president. He wrote volumes of government and historical studies. So he wanted to do this because he wanted to follow in their footsteps. But he couldn't. He found that he could write a speech, but he couldn't write a book in that fashion. However, he literally, from that moment on, became more of a history teacher to Americans than any president ever. And you referred to the economic royalists. So here he is. And by the way, I can show you examples throughout his career. He's constantly because he knew what Americans knew. Somebody once said FDR is successful in his speeches because he somehow knows what Americans need and want to hear, and in any case yearn to hear. They want to hear what it means to be an American. And so when he gives this speech in 1936, accepting the renomination for President of the United States in Philadelphia, he had asked the platform committee to write up the platform as if it was a new Declaration of Independence. Then he went before 100,000 people in a sports stadium to give that speech. And he basically says, in 1776, our ancestors fought against political royalism. And everyone there would have known exactly what he was talking about. In fact, he even said, we're in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a good city to make history, as he put it. And then he goes on and he says, today we are enduring or suffering the rule of economic royalists in the marketplace and the workplace. And then he gives this has got to be the most radical line ever issued by a president. He said, they complain that we want to overthrow American institutions. However, what they know and we know is that that's not the case. We want to overthrow their power.
That's right. He called it the forces of selfishness and lust for power. And he said when he was making his speech for the second in his second campaign, he said, in my first administration, they met their match. And of course, the difference between him, you were talking about what progressives say this today. There are progressives who say it, progressives in power who say it, but lack the courage to actually do it.
Yeah. And he also warned that those folks are going to wrap themselves in the flag.
Yeah. And he said, I welcome their hatred. I welcome their hatred. It's fascinating when you talk about his working through things. He was very quiet about a lot of things until he had made his decision. There were a lot of things even Eleanor didn't know. He would work it through. But also when you were talking about how he became this way, how he became someone ready to take that radical action, ready to take on the hatred of people, I think we shouldn't underestimate the role that Eleanor played. When I was growing up, my mother would say, well, she went out there, he was in a wheelchair, she would be his hands and his eyes. But I think she also led him philosophically. I mean, even the line, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. She was a religious woman. And so she had the biblical concept of the spirit of fear. And she would go back to him and say, there's a spirit of fear. There's a spirit of fear. So when you said a couple of minutes ago, he had this knowledge of what Americans wanted, she would go and experience. I mean, the people that she would invite to Hyde Park, the people that she would invite to the White House, you communists come over because we're going to talk. And she would invite them all to the White House. I mean, she would bring to him the people, the actual people. And people would criticize her for meeting with all these people. And she said, these are the Americans.
Yeah, I definitely want to respond to that. But I want to respond to something just a bit earlier. Mm-hmm. What I figured out, and I did this in consultation with a number of other people who aren't necessarily Roosevelt scholars, but people who knew sort of the family and all that kind of stuff. And what I came to believe is that, as your mother told you, it was Eleanor. When he would go out campaigning, he would sit in the back of an open-air car. It was Eleanor who got out of the car and went into wherever they were. And she would bring back, well, he would talk to people, but she would bring back the inside story, you might say.
That's right.
But here's the other thing. As you know and I know, she went out a lot on her own. She was a journalist.
Absolutely.
She had a column, right? And by the way, she joined the Newspaper Guild Labor Union. So that
she made money for those speeches, which blows my mind. Can you imagine if the First Lady today was going out and getting paid for the talk?
People used to say to him, can't you control your wife?
And I think he said no.
And what they failed to consider is that she was his test. She was testing the waters for some of his very radical ideas. Okay.
Well,
and by the way, his answer, which is a classic answer of those days, was, "Can you control your wife?"
Well, I'm a woman, Harvey, so I'm
fascinated. I said of those days.
Hold on. No, please don't get you're projecting onto me. I'm responding. There was nothing wrong with that. As a woman, I am fascinated by the love triangle there. Eleanor, Lucy Mercer, Roosevelt. I think it did take Eleanor years to come to terms with what he wanted her for and what he didn't want her for. I was reading just the other day about a secretary of his who would talk about, I know in my relationship with my parents, right? I remember things that my mother could go so far. My father always called my mother sweetheart, but if she pushed too hard about something, he'd say, Sophie Ann, and that meant no more. And
sorry, I'm imagining
it's a generational thing. It's not just generational. I think I've been told no more a few times myself, and it's not always wrong. But the phrase that I read about Eleanor and Franklin that was so fascinating to me is there were quote unquote strange reticences between them. There was a place where people would expect him to say, Eleanor, you've gone too far, where he would let her continue. So there was a lot there, It was a little bit of like what Joseph Kennedy and Jackie and, there was a lot there. So I find the whole Eleanor and Franklin story, every part of it, it's just so redolent with every kind of psychological and emotional and political and sexual.
You know what? The further left she went, the polls showed the more popular she became. She was like up in the 80% favorability ratings at the height of that radicalism, like in 1938 or so. I've got numbers around here somewhere. I'd have to pull them off my wall here. I mean, it really, it was astounding. The assumption, and by the way, one of the reasons Republicans became all the more determined to go after her, as well as the Southern Democrats, the white supremacist Southern Democrats, is the fact that they must have known how popular she was becoming, what a threat, because she aligned herself with Southern civil rights activists.
And Marianne Anderson, when the DAR wouldn't allow Marianne Anderson to sing, she arranged for her to be able to sing at the Lincoln Memorial, and then she brought her to the White House, and absolutely.
To his credit, the man who actually arranged that was Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, because as Secretary of the Interior, he controlled the National Mall.
And then his son worked in the Clinton administration, didn't he?
Yeah, no need to go there, right?
The different generations. Okay, so let's continue. I think we've established the radicalism of the New Deal and what he opened up. Was he the first person? I know he would use the phrase social justice, but did that phrase originate with him?
That I don't know, but as apparently you've looked through the FDR and Democracy book, I believe it was after he had won the presidency, or was it just before the election, he gave he gave a sermon, for lack of a better way of putting it, on a Sunday in Detroit, in which he really did emphasize his commitment to social justice. And again, we've already referred to the fact that he committed many a political and moral sin. The point is that was decidedly a motivating factor in much of what he then pursued in the New Deal.
I love this phrase. He said, "In these days of difficulty, we Americans everywhere must and shall choose the path of social justice, the path of faith, the path of hope, and the path of love toward our fellow men." We're talking about him on the domestic front, of course, and it's also true, as everyone knows, that he led the United States during World War II. He took on fascism. He was deeply aware of the threat that Hitler posed long before Pearl Harbor,
Yes.
but the isolationist trend in the United States, particularly understandable given the debacle of World War I, that was
Absolutely.
only 25 years before
Right.
or whatever. But he realized what was happening, and when it was necessary to take on Hitler in the way he did, he certainly did. But I'm going to throw some quotes out, all of which I'm sure that you know very well, but I'd like to know if there are any particular...
And if I don't, I'm going to lie and say I do.
No, you'll know all of these. They're the most famous ones of all. This one I particularly love. It's his "I hate war" quote.
Oh, yeah.
I have seen war. Of course, World War I. He was the Undersecretary of the Navy, right? He said, "I hate war. I have seen war on land and sea. I have seen blood dripping from the wounded. I have seen the dead in the mud. I have seen cities destroyed. I have seen children starving. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war."
Yeah.
Anything
he
you
actually
want to say
had,
about that?
Well, I'll start off by saying when the war began, he actually went to his the actual Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, something like that, and to Wilson, and asked to be relieved of being Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He wanted to serve in the Navy. Mm-hmm. Now, partly it was ambition because he knew what his cousin Teddy had done during the Spanish-American War. He did not want to be left out. But it was also the case he really did believe that in the imperative of halting a war, and that only the United States could do that. But the other thing is that when he was over, he actually stayed on, but he then got permission to go to Europe at the end of the war to see what had transpired. And when some people said, well, he never really served in the military. No, he was there. He saw what that was, the ugliness, the murderousness, the butchering that war entailed. And he was never, ever eager to go to war, even when he knew he had to do it. But he also knew at a certain point he had to do it. And for what it's worth, they knew well before. Sorry, are you going to quote it all from the For Freedom speech? Because I would take us there. He knew from intelligence, meaning, service folk, that that Hitler's plan had already been drawn up as to what he was going to do in the Americas, okay, if opportunity afforded it. But he knew that he could not do certain things, as you were noting, the isolationist sentiment. However, there were surveys that, I've got a volume of these surveys, that showed that when Americans were asked if the only way to stop Hitler was for the United States to enter the war, the numbers changed. In other words, surveys can tell you one thing depending on how they're asked versus others. So in 1941, when he gave the Four Freedoms speech in the State of the Union, that really is his own, in a way, his declaration of war. In other words, he's letting Americans know. He says in that speech, they will not tell us when they will attack us. So he called for the U.S. to become the arsenal of democracy. But knowing all of that and probably believing that Americans were Americans, it's at that moment that he lays out the vision of the four freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And by the way, that speech, even though Americans later could not remember the exact words of the four freedoms, it's that speech that launched a series of decidedly American-like, not only war effort activities, but also led, for example, A. Philip Randolph to launch the March on Washington movement and demand black inclusion in the defense industries. So anyhow, I cut you off.
Freedom from want and freedom from fear is the basis for progressive economic policies.
Absolutely.
And today, as then, the staunch conservatives don't feel that the government does have a responsibility to free people from want or to free people from fear. And that's really what this is all about. If you have a paradigm of the meritocracy, you think, well, if people can't make it, then hey, too bad, they didn't make it. But to actually lay claim to the vision unapologetically and unabashedly that it is a role of government to help people. One of my favorite quotes from Roosevelt is, the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little.
Yeah.
And today that's just, stereotyped as the weakling snowflake, bleeding heart liberal. But during Roosevelt's time, and in a way that we need to reclaim, it is the essence of a progressive vision. Before we get off the... I'm sorry, go on.
In that vein, 1936, when he's running again for president, he gave a speech to unveil a war memorial in St. Louis to honor those who fought in World War I. Mm-hmm. And the speech itself is a very, very surprising speech at a war memorial. He said, basically, I should have put these all next to me, patriotism is about making sure that more Americans get to enjoy what it means to be an American. And that's a paraphrasing. He meant not allowing social justices to prevail. Imagine that. He defined patriotism not, and this is at a war memorial unveiling, he defined it in terms of social justice.
I so agree with him as well. I want to talk about, and I think this is not just about Roosevelt. This, to me, I feel this from Eisenhower as well. One of the things that's most impressive to me about the two of them is that the two men who, on the American side, did more than anyone else to lead us through that war.
Right.
They were not giddy about war the way these youngins are today.
Right.
They were serious, and they hated war. That was what, and you got that from Eisenhower, just like you got that from Roosevelt. These men hated war. It gave them such a sobriety about war. And that's what is so scary about the neocons. That's what's so scary about the George Bushes of the war. They're almost giddy about it. They're a little too excited about it. It's like little boys playing with big guns. And looking to FDR and to the tenor, their emotional tenor, that we're going to kill these people because we must. And there was nothing, there was no smile in that whatsoever. Yeah. Would you agree with what I just said?
Yeah, and as a historical footnote in that vein, only because I know your father served in the Pacific.
He did.
My father served in Europe during the war. It's notable that in 1932, when the bonus marchers were occupying Washington, demanding the monies that had been promised to them in a later year, saying, look, we need the monies you've promised us as a veterans bonus now. And thousands upon thousands came from all over the country to occupy the National Mall and nearby grounds, that the figure who led the troops to surround the encampment was MacArthur.
Really?
Yes. And he ordered the attack on the veterans, which was, by the way, an integrated encampment, black and white. And by the way, and then to bring it back to the Europe side, and my father served in a tank under Patton. Patton was his lieutenant.
Fascinating history.
Okay. And with Eisenhower, my father never voted Republican. But he would never say a bad word about Eisenhower.
Oh, my father did. My father used to say all the time that Eisenhower's most passionate moment about anything going wrong in America was G. So my father
and the G
would
stood for golf, by the way.
yeah, like golly, like gee, McCarthy. Talking about you, McCarthy. The McCarthy.
My father reserved
his
hostility for Nixon.
Yeah. All right, so Roosevelt, one of the tragedies, obviously, of his death, and you've written and talked about this as well, is the plans that he had for the future. He was already talking about what happened at the end of the war, right? The Germans had surrendered, but the Japanese had not surrendered yet. He was already planning a post-World War II America. He wrote this line for a Jefferson Day speech that he did not live to give, but we have the line, and it is, more than an end to war, we want to an end to the beginnings of all wars. I think that's so fascinating. I think that he and those around him were very aware that the Treaty of Versailles after World War I gave us the seeds. And there was so much about the way the world acted, the Allies acted after World War I, that made it easier for the emergence of Hitler, et cetera. And he, whether it was the Marshall Plan, so many of the ways that we treated Japan, we treated Germany after World War II came from this vision that he had, that we need to get it right this time so that we're not just waiting for the next war. And of course, with Eleanor carrying on that legacy, being so involved with the founding of the United Nations, the first delegate to the UN. So even though he didn't live to effectuate that, he already was thinking in terms of the roots of war and that we must address those roots. Once again, such a radical thinker.
Yeah, when even though he lost in the campaign of 1920, when he was the vice presidential member of the ticket, he did not give up the idea of the League of Nations. It was always a part of his thinking. And it's notable that when the war began, we always think of, we think about the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Turkey, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And we think of the Allies, right? Well, the term that he regularly used, even when he used the term Allies, he would soon segue and call the Allied nations the United Nations. This was early on.
Didn't realize
Very
that.
early
That's
on.
great.
I mean, this was decidedly in his mind.
Getting people used to the phrase.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And then, there was something else you said that, anyhow, I mean, yeah. So I think that this vision, and I remember now, when he was, his speech writing team had drafted like several versions of the Four Freedoms speech in 1941. And he and the team came together. He usually gave the team orders, directions, and they would come up with something. And he was known for writing the peroration, the lines that would be remembered. So they're sitting at night in the Oval Office. His secretary, it was, I believe, possibly Robert Sherwood, the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, Harry Hopkins, who really was with him ever since 1933. And I'm forgetting the third, Rosenman, his chief of staff. And they all remembered that at the moment where he's dictating the peroration, that he leans back, it's a silence in the room, and they're all feeling uneasy, and then he lays out the Four Freedoms. And Sherwood, I believe it was, turned to Hopkins and said, was he serious? Because every time he mentioned the Four Freedoms, he would finish with everywhere in the world. Freedom from want, everywhere in the world. Freedom from fear everywhere in the world. And Sherwood, who, as I said, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, turned to Hopkins, who really was this remarkable figure all the way through the administration, and said, was he serious? You realize what that would imply? And he said, well, he's serious. The question is, can we do it? It was always the question, can we get to do it? So, yeah, I mean, again, anyone listening, if you didn't hear the first part of this, we are well aware of the faults and failings of this man. But he had a vision that he believed Americans might well embrace. And if you'll allow me, in 1944, when he offers the vision of an economic Bill of Rights, and this is the key thing about Roosevelt. He once said to a famous woman journalist whose name is escaping me right now, back in the campaign of 32, I never want to be too far out in front of my fellow citizens when I speak. So he would always make sure.
Wow.
Okay. It isn't that he didn't. It wasn't that he wouldn't be in front of them. He just didn't want to necessarily look like he had left them behind, and he was sort of spinning things out of his head. And in 1943, late in 43, with the idea of 44 on the horizon, where it would be the continuation of the war effort and also another presidential campaign, he commissioned a national social research group headquartered at Princeton and asked them to ask Americans, without making this public yet, what do they want at the end of the war?
Yeah, right.
And what he discovered was what he was hoping to discover, that they wanted, as one of the pollsters wrote in a book, Mandate from the People, the Americans wanted everything.
They really did. They wanted everything.
They wanted national health care. They wanted to make sure that young people could get education as far as their abilities would take them.
And even though he was only able to get it as much as the GI Bill, which we know did so much to create the prosperity at the end of World War II, what he wanted was the response to the full desire of the American people, which is free education for everybody.
Yeah,
free college, free technical schools.
National health care, what they used to call universal health care. Okay, education, housing. They wanted, you name it, they wanted it. And by the way,
he would have given it to him.
This wasn't like Democrats wanted it, Republicans didn't. For example, the health care question, 83% said national health care, basically. That was 95% of Democrats, 75% of Republicans. The feeling was so overwhelming that even Thomas Dewey, who became the Republican candidate, had been, I guess, governor of New York, he was this close to embracing the idea of national health care. That's how close because he could sense what was coming out. And Roosevelt then in 44 actually lays out the idea. He said, look, we've come to the point in our history where we realize that needy people are not free people.
You know, Harvey, I think Nixon actually mentioned universal health care, didn't he? I think Nixon
in 1971, he actually proposed a version. And my understanding is that the Democrats thought it was a too cheap a version, that they could do better, and they failed to do so.
One of the greatest triumphs of the Koch brother-inspired neocon far-right in America today is, which you see not only from Republicans, but you even see from establishment Democrats now, is people who are asking for what are traditional American principles articulated by such as Roosevelt: adequate housing, a living wage, free health care, and college to take you as far as you can go. It's, what is it called today? We're the fringe left who want too much too fast. This is why history is so important, that you understand, no, we're asking what are traditional values. There's something I want to go to, though. One more quote. There's such fascination today, introduced, of course, by the, Tucker Carlsons and so forth from the right, this fascination with the autocrats. So not only do we have these terrible autocrats, like Orban, like Erdogan, et cetera, who are on the ascent, there is this popularity here in the United States for the autocratic strongman, our own, of course, even Donald Trump. But when people were trying to present previous to World War II, that maybe the Hitlers of the world or the Mussolinis or the Stalins, maybe they weren't really so bad. There was the same kind of thing going on then. This is a quote from him that I think is just divine. He says, those who seek to established systems of government based on the regimentation of all human beings by a handful of individual rulers, called as a new order. It is not new, and it is not order.
Yeah, 20 different things popped into my head in response to that quote. One, in which I got to tell you, the poet of the 30s, Stephen Spender, I guess it was, had said, fascism is not the wave of the future. He was saying that in response to Charles Lindbergh's wife, who wrote the book, The Wave of the Future. He said, democracy is the wave of the future. Democracy is the revolution. Now, I just had to get that out. But yeah.
And he's right, by the way, and it is a continuous revolution.
Yeah, right, which FDR repeatedly said. In fact, what's interesting is I have up here on my shelf, people probably can't see it, I've got in hard copy all of the speeches of and writings of Franklin Roosevelt. And what's fascinating is how often he made just that point, that democracy was a never-ending march. That's how I think he put it. And he said that repeatedly. And he also, obviously, he took presidential poetic license. He actually talked about the United States as a revolutionary experience, not just at the age of the revolution, but ever after. And always wondered, could we? And he said, yes, we can live up to it. Sorry to steal from Obama. Yes, we can. But it is the case. The thing about Roosevelt is that even those, as I said before, who seemed to have the least to gain from the situation that presented itself, whether they were black or other folks who were living under the poverty line, which we think of today, is that when he spoke, they could hear a promise when he spoke that they were willing to respond to. They didn't just say, we're going to wait on a promise. They were willing to respond. So back during the New Deal, millions of Americans became involved by way of their labors in making the New Deal real. Similarly, in the course of the 1930s, and because we didn't really mention this, the labor movement expanded in the millions. And it wasn't just white workers, white male workers. It was white, black, Latino in vast numbers through the Southwest, women workers. I mean, it was just an amazing period. In fact, it was so, if you like, dynamic that the older labor movement of the American Federation of Labor didn't know how to respond to all this energy from below, which led to the creation of what we come to know as the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And they actually put out a poster in their organizing efforts. They wrote on it, if I were working in a factory, I'd join a labor union. And they signed it with FDR's name. Now, people say, well, he never actually said that. But he knew it was there, and he didn't ask it to be taken down.
I think something similar is going on today. I think something very profound is going on with Christian Smalls, what's happening at Amazon, what's happening at Starbucks, a new generation that comes up rediscovering the impulse of labor, the importance of labor, the necessity of labor for any kind of a balanced society. Something else I want to say in regard to a comment you made earlier. You talked about how as a president, he was so knowledgeable of history and would use historical references in his talking to the American people. Another president who did that, of course, was JFK. JFK was very much a historian and really contextualized a lot of his thinking, even in his speeches. Within his story.
Yeah, and I'm not a big JFK fan, okay? And the reason is, after the war, in the late 1940s, there was a veterans group that was organized called the American Veterans Committee, which was a decidedly progressive veterans organization. And the leadership included such as, one of Roosevelt's own sons, the man who would go on to an acting career, having won the Congressional Medal of Honor, Audie Murphy, Bill Malden, the cartoonist. Mm-hmm. Strangely enough, I think Ronald Reagan was actually actively a member of that. And by the way, in 1960, in 1960, there were 4 veterans on the tickets, okay? It was Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., I think, was behind there. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it was John F. Kennedy and LBJ, right? Now, the irony in all of that is that Henry Cabot Lodge, the Republican, was the only one who had been a member of this Progressive American Veterans Committee. But the other thing is that when JFK came back and his father promoted him to run for Congress, JFK made it clear. He would tell people, he actually said, I am not a liberal. I did not join the American Veterans Committee. And then in 1960, the greatest obstacle to his winning the nomination was Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah, she didn't like him, but he went and he charmed her. He charmed her. He went to visit her, and he apparently, because she was a big Adlai Stevenson person.
Absolutely, which would not have been my choice either.
And he charmed her. Yeah.
But let me just finish up because it's just one of these ironies, you might say. The man who was responsible for writing the 1960 Democratic Party platform had been himself in the Roosevelt administration, head of the Office of Price Administration during the war. And he traveled the country to write up this platform. And he modeled the entire platform after FDR's Economic Bill of Rights and blatantly indicates it in the platform. And in his memoir, he said, my only fear is that Kennedy would have rejected the platform. Now, Kennedy, once he became president, got pushed. He was pushed into becoming more of a liberal than he might ever have expected himself to become.
Well, I don't know. If Bobby Kennedy were here, he would say my brother was in transition. My brother was evolving.
I'm just the historian reporting what I know.
Yeah. And he also did some things that were pretty extraordinary. I mean, he was the one who sent the troops down to Alabama. I mean, I think, if anything, to me, the profundity of history is that these were human beings.
But he had a good precedent, and you brought up the prior precedent in another president. And that is, for all of his conservatism, Eisenhower did use troops in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay.
He did.
In fact, a good line from Eisenhower, you'll want to remember this. Eisenhower was being courted to run either as a Democrat or Republican.
They both wanted him.
In 1954, in the midterm election period, he had 2 brothers, a liberal and a conservative. His conservative brother, who was down in Texas, wrote to him and said, what kind of conservative are you? And he lays out, why haven't you done this? Why haven't you done that? And I'm not sure if you know about this letter. He wrote back to his brother. And by the way, what he wrote to his brother is exactly what he told his press secretary on a Sunday afternoon's walk. He said, any party that messes with the rights of workers, Social Security, he went right through the liberal agenda. Any party that does that will never be heard from this again, will never be heard again in this country.
Yeah, I read that recently. And also, of course, his farewell address and his phrasing, his coining the phrase military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
So all
powerful,
in all, Republican
powerful.
or not, Eisenhower, between being the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II and the military-industrial complex speech alone, great honor, great kudos to him. I can't thank you enough, Harvey. I feel, like I said before, I feel we could talk for hours about many things, but I really appreciate your talking to me today. And what you have done for so many, and what I hope we did a little bit on this podcast today, was to awaken more curiosity, more understanding in people who might not have given Franklin Roosevelt all that much thought. We need his spirit today. We need a genuine progressive vision. We need to become, as he said, fairly radical for at least a generation. We need to push back against those who say now exactly what they said to him. You're a socialist, you're a communist, and say, I welcome their hatred. Point out that it's just a bunch of propaganda. I do want to finish with one little story that I'm sure you know. There was a great rift, of course, within the family, the Roosevelt family. And he had been turned down for some club membership in Harvard. And I was reading a story about how his aunts and uncles were saying, if only they had not turned him down, that they saw that as the root of his class anger. at the hoity-toity people, because they said, why does he have so much upset with the hoity-toity people? He's a Roosevelt.
Yeah, I'm gonna take advantage of my speaking to you, and you can cut this out afterward if you wish in the editing. And this is going to take us. I said early on that I wanted to say something about Bernie and all of this. Okay, so in 2015 and again in 2019, before each of those election years of 16 and 20, Bernie gave a speech first at Georgetown and then at George Washington University, and made it a point of recovering and recalling FDR's Economic Bill of Rights. Okay.
And using the phrase economic royalism.
Yeah. The shame was that Bernie never really took it on the road. Okay. And this to me was the tragedy. When he stood on the and I know they pushed you out of those events eventually, but when he stood with the smaller cohort of so-called Democratic candidates, and they would charge him with wanting to bankrupt America with Medicare for all, it was sad that he didn't know that he should have just called FDR into the room and reminded Americans of what another generation had accomplished in the midst of a crisis, and that it was the greatest, capital D, Democratic president ever who had done that. That remains my very biggest complaint about somebody who I've admired ever since the 1980s. But I just want to add that recently, I've worked with Alan Minsky, who is executive director of Progressive Democrats of America, and we have composed, in hopes of reviving the idea, not letting it get away, a 21st century economic Bill of Rights, hoping that calling on progressive political figures, either in office or aspiring, to embrace it, because the overwhelming majority of Americans want exactly what we talked about before. They want guaranteed health care. They want the ability to pursue education as far as their abilities can take them. They want to live in comfortable housing, and I could go out. They want a job with a living wage. So anyhow, thanks. If you cut it out, whatever.
There's no need to cut that out. I love Bernie, and Bernie's a human being, and what he's done for us so outweighs any mistakes we might find. And I know that you know that too. I think what you were talking about, though, in terms of an economic Bill of Rights was extremely important. And I have long thought that whoever runs for president in 2024 with a progressive vision should make part of his or her agenda an economic Bill of Rights. So I thank you, Harvey, for articulating that the way you have and making it so clear. I'm sure I'm not the only person who has taken note of that and realizes that is the way we need to go.
I hope so, but I'm thrilled that you have taken note of that.
Oh, yeah, I took note. Much love to you, Harvey Kaye. I hope that this is just one of many times that we will have a chance, perhaps privately as well as publicly, to talk about such things as we talked about today. I will continue to listen to you. I will continue to read, and I look forward to the next time.
Thank you for the invitation, and just to assure you that I'm ready to talk anytime, you have my phone number.
God bless you, honey. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was my conversation with Harvey Kaye. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Remember, his book is called FDR on Democracy. Check out all of his books. He's really something. And I want to close with a story, something that just happened to me yesterday. I had done an event at the MLK Memorial, and Lauren, who works with me, knew that I was doing this conversation today. She knew that I'd been reading about FDR. And she pointed out that the FDR Memorial is just really a few yards away from the MLK. It was a lovely night. I said, sure, let's go over there. I had visited it once a few years ago, but hadn't been back since I've come to live in Washington, D.C. We were strolling through the memorial, and I was reading all these profound quotes from FDR, many of which we talked about today with Harvey. And I was feeling the weight of what trouble we are in our country today, and how much we need an FDR. And when I was about halfway through, strolling through the monument, I noticed that there was a group of young people. I think they were high school. They looked about high school age to me. Quite a few of them, 30, 35 kids. And there was a guide. And I don't know if the guide was their teacher, their American history teacher. I think he probably was. He could have been someone from the monument, but there was just more to it going on. I think he was probably their teacher. And at every stop along the way of the monument because that's how it works, a quote of his, a statue, etc. The teacher was explaining to these students what was going on in America at the time, what was going on in Roosevelt's life, what this meant. He was teaching them not just the words inscribed in the stone, but he was making them come alive. He was doing what great teachers do. And I turned around to look at the young people, and I saw myself at their age. And, some of them looked like, not that interested, kind of bored, and then some of them were just mesmerized. I was looking at this one girl, and she was just mesmerized by everything he was saying. I walked for a while, listening to him. It was so interesting, and he, this guy had it right. And when I left there, I was very moved. But I wasn't just moved by Roosevelt, because for me recently, as I'm sure for many of us, it's almost painful to be moved by Roosevelt when you compare it to what's happening in America today and how we so need this kind of philosophy and politics, and it's not happening. When I walked out, though, I had hope for this country. But it wasn't just hope because of the words of Roosevelt that I had seen inscribed on the walls of the monument. I had hope because I saw those young people reading those words, being taught about those words, getting it, grokking it. I saw these words enter their hearts because of that man, a great teacher. And because of that, I walked out of there and thought, we're going to be okay. Because generations that come after the great ones like Roosevelt, who understand what he did in his time, will be able to do in our time and in their time what generations before us did in theirs. Nothing helps that process like reading what those people said, what they were about, what they did, Roosevelt and others. This book, The Greatest Speeches and Writings of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt by Harvey Kaye, is such an example. And I feel honored to have had him on the podcast today. And I assume that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks so much.